Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and unhurried, like someone quietly sweeping away the dust of the day. Streets gleamed with reflections, streetlights melting into puddles, passing cars leaving trails of silver ripples. I had no intention of going anywhere that night. Yet somehow, my feet carried me through the drizzle, down a narrow lane I didn't remember noticing before, toward a faint amber glow at the end. It was there, between two closed bookstores. Then I saw it, a small wooden door with a handwritten sign swinging gently in the wind. The Café that never closes. The letters shimmered as if the paint itself was alive, catching each drop of rain like a spark. I hesitated, hand hovering near the doorknob. I'd walked these streets 100 times, but never once had I seen this place. Maybe it only showed up when the city was quiet enough to listen. Inside, the hum of rain softened to a whisper. The door shut behind me with a sound that felt like an exhale. Warm air wrapped around my shoulders. I could smell cinnamon, roasted coffee, and something faintly citrus, bergamot maybe. The light was golden and low, spilling from small lamps shaped like raindrops. Wooden tables sat unevenly, worn smooth by time and stories. A gramophone in the corner played something slow, like a lullaby with no words. I took a step forward. The air itself seemed to shimmer, not with magic, exactly, but with memory. Everything looked familiar and strange at once. There were shelves of books without titles, walls lined with old clocks that ticked at different rhythms, and a mirror near the counter that reflected not your face, but your mood. Behind the counter stood a barista, middle-aged, with hair tied loosely and eyes calm as still water. She smiled the moment our eyes met, not the polite smile of someone welcoming a stranger, but a smile that said, "I've been expecting you." "Rough night?" she asked softly. Her voice was warm, like the light itself. I nodded without thinking. "How did you?" She waved gently toward a table near the window. "Everyone who finds this place has something heavy to put down. Sit. I'll bring you something warm." The chair creaked as I settled into it. Outside, rain drew silver threads across the glass, stitching the darkness together. The sound of cups clinking, low murmurs, and rain blended into something that wasn't quite silence, but felt close to peace. A man in a brown coat sat by the far corner, sketching with a trembling hand. An elderly woman read a book upside down, as if the words didn't matter, only the act of turning pages. Every face held a softness, as though each had come here to rest their heart for a while. When I looked back toward the counter, the barista was already there, holding a porcelain cup that steamed gently. "Bergamot and honey," she said. "You used to like that." I blinked. "Used to?" Her smile deepened. "You'll remember soon." Outside, thunder rolled far away, like someone moving furniture in the sky. I lifted the cup. The steam fogged my glasses for a moment, and when I took the first sip, warmth bloomed through me. Not just the heat of the tea, but something deeper, something that recognized me. A flicker of memory surfaced. A similar cup, a different night, laughter under an umbrella. I couldn't catch the face, but the feeling was there, soft, familiar, painful. When I looked up again, the barista was gone, tending to another table. The gramophone clicked and began a new melody, low piano, a whisper of rain against the glass. I realized then that the cafe wasn't quite a place. It was more like a pause between heartbeats, the kind that happens when you finally stop running from yourself. Somewhere outside, a clock tower struck 11. I exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something close to calm. The kind of calm that doesn't ask questions. The rain continued, tireless and tender, as if the sky was gently washing the city clean, and for reasons I didn't understand yet. I knew this wouldn't be my only visit. The rain didn't let up. It softened, perhaps, but it never stopped. A patient rhythm against the windows, like breathing. The cafe glowed in its own small world, separated from the storm by nothing but glass and faith. I sat there, holding the warm cup between my palms, watching the steam curl into shapes that almost looked like words. Every corner of the room seemed alive in quiet ways. The lamps hummed gently. The gramophone whispered its low song, and somewhere behind the counter, I could hear water pouring, the barista preparing another drink. The scent of baked bread and honey floated through the air, weaving between voices that spoke softly, as though everyone here understood the sacredness of hush. A couple of candles flickered on nearby tables. Their flames tilted toward each other whenever the door opened, as if bowing to the wind before returning to stillness. Outside, puddles caught the light and held it, trembling with each raindrop that fell. The barista appeared again, this time carrying a tray of pastries. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if every motion was a kind of meditation. "You'll want this," she said, placing a small piece of bread before me. It was still warm, its crust dusted with sugar that glimmered faintly in the lamplight. I took a bite. The taste was simple but deep. Butter, cinnamon, and something almost floral. For a moment, it made me think of mornings long ago, the smell of my mother's kitchen, soft laughter in another time. I hadn't remembered that in years. "You keep this place open all night?" I asked, breaking the silence. She smiled, eyes kind but unreadable. "We don't close." "Not really. The door opens when it's needed." "You must have had something on your mind tonight." I nodded, unsure what to say. The truth sat just beneath my tongue, too heavy to speak aloud. She didn't press. Instead, she poured a second cup and placed it in front of the empty chair across from me. "For whoever you wish was here," she said. That the gesture caught me off guard. I stared at the cup for a while, watching its steam drift upward, merging with the glow around the lamps. It almost felt like an invitation, not to someone else, but to the memory of them. I looked out the window again. Raindrops traced paths down the glass, racing each other to the sill, merging, splitting, vanishing. The reflections of the street beyond were blurred. Cars turned to smears of gold, people to soft shadows. The sound of the rain grew louder, then faded again, like a tide that didn't know whether to come or go. The cafe seemed to breathe with me. Each inhale carried the scent of wet earth and bergamot. Each exhale softened the ache in my chest, just a little. I watched as the man in the brown coat gathered his sketchbook and left. When the door closed behind him, no rain entered, just a cool breath of wind carrying the sound of thunder far away. A new patron entered moments later, a young woman with a coat too thin for the weather, eyes shining with the kind of tiredness I recognized. The barista met her with the same warmth she'd shown me, leading her to a corner seat, handing her a towel and a cup dot. It was then I realized no one here asked for anything. They simply arrived, and what they needed appeared. The cafe seemed to know. The clock above the counter ticked slowly, its hands moving almost reluctantly, as if time too was enjoying the calm. I thought of the world outside, the emails, the calls, the endless chasing of something that never stopped running. Here, none of that mattered. Here, it felt enough just to breathe. I leaned back, letting the rhythm of the rain fill me. My thoughts drifted to the person I'd once been, the promises I'd broken, the apologies I never sent. The second cup of tea still sat untouched across from me, steam rising faintly like a ghost sigh. For a fleeting moment, I imagined them sitting there, not as they were, but as they might be now, older, quieter, maybe even healed. I almost spoke aloud, just to say, "I'm sorry." But instead, I lifted my cup and let the warmth reach my throat. The words stayed behind my teeth, dissolving into the taste of bergamot and honey dot outside. The storm deepened. Yet inside, the cafe glowed even warmer, a lighthouse in miniature. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the rain to stop. I wanted it to keep falling, just a little longer. When I looked up again, the barista was polishing a cup behind the counter, humming a tune that seemed older than the cafe itself. The melody had no beginning or end, just a looping hum that blended perfectly with the sound of rain. I watched her for a while, wondering if she ever grew tired. The cafe felt eternal, untouched by hours or fatigue. I finally walked over, cup in hand. "Have you worked here long?" I asked, joking. She smiled without looking up. "Long enough to remember most faces, even the ones that think they're strangers." Her answer made me pause. There was something in her tone, not mystical, not rehearsed, just true. Like she wasn't talking about memory the way most people did. "Do you remember mine?" I asked. She met my gaze, and for a moment, her eyes reflected the amber light of the lamps so perfectly that it felt like she held a piece of the room inside her. "Yes," she said. "You used to come here on nights like this. Not always for tea. Sometimes you just sat, listening. But I've never been here before," I said, my voice softer than I meant. She only tilted her head. "Maybe not with your feet." The gramophone skipped, crackled, and returned to its song. I felt something stir in me, not fear, but recognition. Like remembering a dream you thought you'd made up. "What is this place, really?" I asked. The barista wiped her hands on a towel. "It's what you need it to be. For some, it's rest. For others, remembrance. Tonight, it's a pause for you, between the leaving and the returning." I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't ask again. She poured me another cup, slower this time, her hands steady and precise. The scent of the tea filled the space between us. "You always liked the first sip best," she murmured. There was tenderness in her words, the kind that comes from having watched people change slowly, gently, over many rains. At the far end of the cafe, an old clock chimed midnight, softly, as if apologizing for interrupting the calm. The door opened, and another figure entered. A man in a navy coat, shoulders wet, holding a bouquet of rain-damp lily. He placed them carefully on the counter, the petals trembling with every drop. "Still open?" he asked. "Always," she said. He smiled faintly, glancing around the room. When his eyes met mine, he nodded, the kind of nod shared by travelers who don't need to know each other's names. Then he sat by the fire, arranging the lily on his lap as though comforting them. The barista leaned closer to me. "He comes here every year," she whispered. "Same night, same rain." "Why?" "To remember the one he loved," she said simply. "She never made it home one stormy night. He believes she still walks through this door sometimes." I watched the man, the way he stared into the firelight, lips moving slightly, as if repeating a prayer or a conversation left unfinished. There was no sorrow in his face, only softness, the kind that follows after years of learning how to live with absence. The barista turned back to me. "Most people come here for something they've lost. Some leave lighter. Some stay a while longer." "And me?" I asked. She smiled. "You haven't decided yet." Rain pressed harder against the glass, wind whispering like voices just outside. I thought of the letter still folded in my coat pocket, the one I'd never mailed. The edges had softened over the years, but the words inside still felt raw. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth seep into the quiet ache behind my ribs. Maybe the cafe wasn't about answers. Maybe it was about having somewhere gentle enough to hold the questions. When I looked up, the barista had moved down the counter, laughing softly with a new guest. Her laughter sounded like something you could almost remember from childhood. Not the sound itself, but the safety inside it. I sat there until the rain changed its rhythm again, lighter, hesitant, like the storm itself was beginning to rest. And when I finally stood to return to my table, I realized the cup I'd left behind was gone. In its place was a folded napkin, still damp with a tea ring in the shape of a heart. The seat by the window was still warm when I returned to it, as though it had been waiting. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist, and the reflections of the lamps in the puddles looked like melted stars. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, tracing the path of a raindrop as it slid downward and vanished at the sill. For reasons I couldn't explain, that small motion felt meaningful, like a memory of something gentle and forgotten. The cafe around me had quieted. The man with the lily had fallen asleep in his chair, head tilted back, a faint smile still resting on his lips. The young woman with the thin coat sat near the door, her fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The barista wiped down the counter, humming the same endless tune. I watched the rhythm of everything, the drip of rain, the flicker of the candle flame, the rise and fall of my own breath. Time seemed to stretch and fold here, like fabric being smoothed by invisible hands. The napkin with the tea ring still lay in front of me. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting words to appear. There were none, just the faint shape of the cups. Bottom, an imperfect circle, a quiet echo of something that had once been full. I smiled. Maybe that was the point. I leaned back in my chair and let the sounds drift closer. The soft clatter of dishes, the rustle of a turning page, the sigh of the wind against the door. The rain outside had thinned to the kind that only a few people notice. Fine, whispering, more scent than sound. It reminded me of nights long ago when I used to walk home with someone, sharing a single umbrella, trying to keep our shoulders from getting wet. I remembered her voice, low, steady, with a laugh that always arrived late, as if she didn't want to interrupt the night. We never said the words we should have. We thought we had time. Doesn't everyone? Is it easier? I murmured to the window. To remember than to forget? The reflection in the glass looked back. Tired eyes, a faint smile. Someone softer than I used to be. Maybe that was the work of the rain, to blur edges until everything looked kinder. The barista came over, drying her hands on a cloth. "You're thinking too loudly," she said. I laughed quietly. I didn't mean to. She nodded toward the window. That seat brings out the confessions. Must be the view. Do you believe that? That the rain listens? She tilted her head. I think it remembers. Everything that falls eventually returns. To the sky, to the sea, to someone's story. I looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her expression. Not pity, not curiosity, just presence. The kind that doesn't demand anything. Do people ever find what they're looking for here? I asked. Sometimes, she said. But more often, they find what they forgot they already had. She left a small candle on my table before walking away. Its light flickered gently, reflecting in the window, so that it looked like another star floating beside me. The warmth of it reached just far enough to touch my hands. I picked up the pen from the corner of the table. I hadn't noticed it before, lying beside a stack of unused napkins. The ink smelled faintly of cedar. I hesitated, then began to write. Not to anyone else, not yet, but to myself. "You've carried this long enough," I wrote. "It's okay to set it down. The rain will remember for you." When I finished, I folded the napkin carefully and placed it beside the candle. A sense of stillness settled inside me, deep and quiet, like a lake after a storm. I didn't know how long I sat there after that. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The rain shifted again, returning to a steady rhythm. The man in the corner stirred awake. The young woman smiled faintly into her cup. Life resumed its small, unhurried ways. I closed my eyes, listening. Not for answers, but for the comfort of not needing them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, the kind that sounds like the sky clearing its throat before falling silent again. I whispered a thank you, not sure to whom. Maybe to the café, maybe to the night, maybe to the part of me that had finally decided to come in from the rain dock. And in that moment, as another droplet traced its path down the glass, I felt it, the smallest flicker of peace. Not loud, not triumphant, just enough to stay. When the barista returned, she carried a small porcelain teapot shaped like a cloud. Steam drifted upward in soft ribbons, catching the lamplight like threads of silk. She poured slowly, the amber liquid swirling into my cup with a quiet that made even the rain pause to listen. "This one's special," she said, setting the pot down gently. "We call it the tea that listens." I smiled faintly. "Listens?" She nodded. "It doesn't change its flavor for anyone, but it changes the drinker. You'll see." The phrase lingered in my mind long after she walked away. I watched the steam rise and twist, as if the tea really were listening, waiting. My reflection trembled on its surface, broken each time a droplet from the ceiling's leak tapped the wooden table. I lifted the cup. The first sip was simple, warm, faintly floral, sweetened by honey. But as it rested on my tongue, something shifted. It wasn't taste I felt. It was memory. The warmth seemed to echo down my throat into my chest, pulling loose something that had been knotted for years. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I wasn't in the cafe anymore. I was standing in the rain of another night, younger, foolishly certain that life could be paused until I was ready. She was beside me, her hair damp and sticking to her cheeks, laughing as we tried to share a too small umbrella. Her laughter mixed with the thunder, light and unbothered. "You always rush ahead," she said. "One day you'll learn to walk with the rain." I remember how I smiled then, pretending to understand. How I kissed her cheek before she crossed the street. How I didn't call out when she looked back one last time. Then the memory dissolved, like steam fading from the cup. I opened my eyes, breathing slowly. The cafe had returned around me. The lamps, the smell of cinnamon, the low hum of rain. My hands trembled slightly, and I realized I was smiling through tears. The tea had listened, indeed. The barista was nearby, stacking cups. She noticed my expression and nodded, as though she'd seen this moment 1,000 times before. "It always knows what to bring up," she said softly, "but only what you're ready to hear." Was she real? I asked before I could stop myself. Her answer was simple. All memories are real while they're being felt. She walked away again, leaving me with my thoughts. I stared into the cup, now half empty, the amber liquid reflecting the candle's flame like a tiny sun caught in twilight. At the next table, the young woman who'd entered earlier was sketching on a napkin. I watched her for a while, the way she leaned close to her drawing, her lips moving faintly as if whispering to it. When she looked up, our eyes met. There was something familiar in her face, though I couldn't place it. She smiled, a quiet, understanding smile, and went back to her sketch. Outside, a gust of wind pressed rain against the windows, scattering the reflections into 100 tiny ripples. I realized that no two raindrops ever took the same path down the glass. Each found its own way, yet all ended in the same still puddle below. Maybe that's what healing looked like, not erasing the path, but letting it reach where it was always meant to go. I took another sip. The tea had cooled, but the warmth inside me hadn't faded. There was a small box on the counter, a tin one, labeled letters for the morning. I'd noticed it earlier, but hadn't thought much of it. Now it caught my attention. Patrons were quietly folding napkins, tucking them inside. As though leaving something behind, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old letter, the one that had traveled with me through apartments, moves, and years. The paper had yellowed at the folds, the ink smudged from time and touch. I unfolded it one last time. The words inside were shaky, uncertain, a mix of apology and longing. I read them silently, then folded it again, smaller this time. When I stood, my chair made no sound against the floor. The room seemed to part for me, the air thick with steam and rain and memory. I walked to the counter, lifted the lid of the tin box, and placed the letter inside. It fit as though it had always belonged there. The barista didn't say anything. She just placed her hand gently on the lid, closing it with a soft click. Outside, lightning flickered behind the clouds, but there was no thunder. Only a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. I went back to my table, lighter somehow. The napkin where I'd written earlier now glowed faintly in the candlelight. I placed the empty cup beside it. The tea had finished listening. I whispered into the steam that remained, "Thank you." And though no one answered, I swear I heard something in the rhythm of the rain, like a voice saying, "You're welcome." The candle's flame had grown smaller now, a quiet dot of gold, fighting the deep blue shadows that filled the cafe. Outside, the rain had steadied again, no longer a storm, just a gentle reminder that the night still had something to say. I sat there in the hush, tracing circles on the table with my fingertip, where the cup had left its faint ring. Something inside me felt emptied, but in a good way, like when you finally exhaled after holding your breath too long. The silence didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt wide, roomy, like there was finally space for the world to move through me. The barista came by with a cloth over her shoulder, collecting plates and half-finished cups. "You've been quiet a long time," she said softly. I nodded. "It feels like if I speak, the air might break." She smiled. "Then stay quiet a little longer. The rain doesn't like to be interrupted when it's healing someone." I let that thought settle. Healing. I hadn't realized that's what I'd been doing, or what the cafe had been doing for me, but the word fit. The ache in my chest wasn't gone, but it had changed shape. Softer, rounder, no longer sharp. I watched her move from table to table, gentle as the rain itself. She stopped by the man with the lily, now awake, and helped him tie the bouquet with a thin blue ribbon. He thanked her, his voice gravelly but kind. Then he turned to me and said, "Keep your letter safe. They have a way of finding who they're meant for." I wanted to ask him how he knew, but he was already gone, slipping into the mist beyond the door. The young woman who'd been sketching finished her napkin drawing and stood as well. She passed by my table and with a shy smile slid the napkin toward me. "For you," she said. It was a sketch of a cup beside a folded letter, steam rising into the shape of two hands meeting. Beneath it, in neat handwriting, she'd written, "We are all just messages the rain carries." Before I could reply, she was gone too, her reflection vanishing into the wet street outside. The barista glanced at the drawing and chuckled. "She leaves those for anyone who forgets they're still loved." The words hit something deep in me. I looked around the cafe again. The warm lights, the uneven chairs, the endless tick of mismatched clocks. None of it felt random. It all pulsed with quiet intention, as though the place itself was breathing with the people who entered it. I turned back to the window. The glass was streaked with 100 trails of water, each one a different journey toward the same sill. The city beyond blurred and shimmered, almost dreamlike. And then, in the faint reflection, I saw her, not the barista, not the girl with the sketch. Her, the woman from my memory, standing just behind me in the glass. She looked younger than she should have, smiling with that same gentle tilt of her head I'd never forgotten. There was no sound, no shock, only a stillness that wrapped itself around me like a coat. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I knew what they were. I always had. It's okay. You can rest now. My eyes stung, but I didn't look away. I wanted to hold that reflection as long as I could, even if it wasn't real. Or maybe because it was. When I blinked, she was gone. The window showed only rain again, the kind that blurs everything it touches. The barista returned quietly, setting another napkin in front of me. For writing down what you don't need to carry anymore, she said. I stared at it for a long minute, the pen beside it gleaming faintly. And then I began to write, not a letter this time, not to her or to the past, but to myself. That I forgive you for not knowing how to stay. I forgive you for trying to love through silence. I forgive you for walking in the wrong storms before finding this one. The words came easily now. When I finished, I folded the napkin and handed it to the barista. She smiled, slid it into a small envelope, and sealed it with a stamp shaped like a raindrop. Keep this, she said. Open it again the next time you forget how far you've come. I tucked it into my coat pocket. The envelope was warm, as if it held more than paper. Maybe it did. For a long while, we said nothing. The cafe breathed, the rain whispered, and the clocks ticked in their uncoordinated, comforting way. Then she poured me one last cup of tea. This one, she said, is for staying. The first sip tasted like home. Not any particular home, but the idea of one, the warmth, the acceptance, the permission to stop running. And as I looked out at the night, the reflection of the candle on the window became another light, small but steady, burning softly in the endless rain. The rain eased into something gentler, not quite mist, not quite drizzle, a tender balance between falling and floating. Through the window, the world outside looked softened, blurred by silver light. The barista dimmed the lamps one by one, leaving only the glow of candles and the low amber hue from behind the counter. The cafe felt suspended between time and dream. I sipped slowly from my cup, letting the last warmth slide down my throat. The tea's sweetness clung to my lips, and I could almost taste the air, a mix of rain, cinnamon, and the faint smoke of melting wax. Somewhere in the distance, a piano note hummed. Or maybe it was the wind playing against the window. That was when I noticed her, the woman sitting 2 tables away, half hidden behind a vase of dried lavender. She must have entered quietly, because I hadn't seen the door open. Her hair was dark and slightly tangled, her hands cupped around a steaming mug. But it was her eyes that held me, rain bright, full of something I recognized too easily, understanding. When our gazes met, she smiled, not out of politeness, but like someone recognizing a traveler who's walked a similar road. She stood, carrying her mug, and nodded toward the empty seat across from me. May I? I gestured for her to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the space between words. Then she said softly, You came here because of someone. I blinked, a little startled, then laughed quietly. Is it that obvious? It always is, she said. This place only appears to people who've loved deeply enough to hurt. Her voice carried the same calm as the barista's, but it was younger, softer, like silk worn thin from being touched too often. She looked down at her cup and continued, The first time I came here, I couldn't speak at all. I just cried into my tea. The barista didn't ask questions. She just refilled it until I was ready. There was no sadness in her tone now, only acceptance. What brought you back? I asked. She tilted her head. Forgiveness. For him. For me. For everything we thought was forever. She smiled faintly. And you? I hesitated, watching the rain run down the glass in slow threads. For a long time, I carried a letter I never sent. I thought keeping it meant holding on to love. But tonight, I think I learned that love doesn't need to be kept. It needs to be released. She nodded, her eyes softening. That's the part that hurts the most. Realizing letting go doesn't mean losing. We sat quietly after that, two strangers sharing a silence that felt like prayer. I could hear her breathing, slow, steady, matching the rhythm of the rain. There was something healing in that, in the proof that other hearts had broken and still chosen to stay open. After a while, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The first time I came here, I wrote a letter too, to the person I thought I'd never forgive. She unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. I come back sometimes to read it, to remember that pain also made me gentle. She passed it across the table. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. Just the gesture itself was enough. A letter written, not destroyed. A wound turned into a story. You remind me of him, she said quietly. Not the face, but the way you look at the rain, like you're waiting for it to say something. I smiled. Maybe I am. She finished her tea, then stood. When you leave, look behind you, she said. You'll see the cafe differently. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already walking toward the barista, placing her cup carefully on the counter. The two exchanged a glance, a wordless thank you, and then she stepped through the door. The bell above it chimed once, twice, then fell silent. When I turned back to the window, the rain had grown lighter still, so faint it barely touched the glass. Her seat was empty, except for the lavender vase she'd moved slightly toward the center of the table. The scent drifted across the room, mixing with bergamot and the faint sweetness of bread cooling on the counter. Looked down at the folded letter she'd left behind. It wasn't hers, it was mine. The same one I'd placed in the tin box. My name written on it in her handwriting. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The moment I touched it, something in me quieted, as if the cafe was reminding me that some things once released have a way of finding their way home. The barista's voice came softly from behind me. You see? The cafe remembers. And outside, the rain began again, just enough to blur the world into beauty. The clock above the counter ticked with an almost tender rhythm, steady, unhurried, each second dissolving softly into the next. I hadn't noticed before, but none of the clocks here matched. Each ticked at its own pace, as if time inside the cafe was allowed to breathe differently for everyone. The barista had told me earlier that the place didn't close. Now I wondered if that was because here, time itself didn't really move. It simply rested. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze wander from one clock to another. Some had pendulums swaying like sleepy hearts. Others were frozen at impossible hours. 3:17, 11:03, 6:42. I wondered what moments they belonged to, whose memories they held. The letter still lay before me, the one that had somehow found its way back from the tin box, returned by the woman with quiet eyes. I didn't open it. There was a strange peace in leaving it folded, like an unopened window. You know the breeze will reach anyway. The barista came to my table again, setting down a glass of water that shimmered in the candlelight. Midnight's gentle here, she said, glancing toward the clocks. It doesn't hurry anyone out. Does it ever reach morning? I asked. She smiled. When it's ready. The dawn doesn't arrive by hour here. It arrives by acceptance. Her words settled deep, the kind that don't need understanding right away. I looked outside. The city lights had dimmed behind the mist. Even the rain seemed slower now, the drops heavier, deliberate, as if each one was trying to remember its way home. The reflections on the pavement had turned to long silver threads, weaving and unweaving like lullabies. The man with the lily had not returned. The young woman's sketch rested safely in my pocket. The other tables had emptied without sound. leaving only the scent of tea and candle smoke in their place. It struck me then that the cafe didn't feel empty when people left. It felt fulfilled, like a heart that had finally exhaled. The barista poured herself a cup and joined me at the table across from mine. For the first time, she looked less like the keeper of this place and more like someone simply living inside it, same as I was. "Do you ever leave?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Sometimes, but the rain always brings me back." "Why?" She traced a circle on the table with her fingertip. "Because someone has to remember the sound of peace. When people forget, the world gets louder. So I keep the quiet here until they find it again." Her words were said so simply, but I felt them in my bones. We sat together in silence for a while, listening. The sound of the rain against the glass was slow, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Every now and then, a drop would slide down the window, tracing a tiny light trail through the candle's reflection before disappearing into the dark. "Do you think everyone comes back?" I asked. "Not always," she said. "Some don't need to. The ones who do, they return with softer eyes." "Like yours?" I said before realizing how the words might sound. She chuckled quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just learned to see the parts of people that shine through the fog." Her gaze drifted toward the clocks. One of them, a small brass one near the shelf, let out a quiet chime. The sound was thin, fragile, yet it filled the entire room. "That one only rings when someone has made peace with their story," she said. I smiled faintly. "Then who was it this time?" She looked at me, eyes warm. "You, of course." The words caught in my throat. There was no ceremony, no flash of revelation, just that quiet certainty in her voice. And suddenly, I knew she was right. The heaviness I'd carried for so long, the guilt, the unspoken apology, the longing had all loosened somewhere between the rain and the tea. It hadn't vanished. It had transformed. The barista stood and gathered her cup. "You'll start to feel sleepy soon," she said. "That's how the cafe lets you go gently, like rain easing into dawn." I didn't argue. My eyelids felt heavier already, my thoughts softer around the edges. The candle's flame blurred slightly, its light blending with the reflections on the window. "I'm not sure I want to wake up," I murmured. "You won't," she said with a small smile. "You'll just go on carrying a little more quiet than before." And with that, she left me there, alone but not lonely, surrounded by clocks that ticked at their own forgiving rhythm. Outside, the world waited beneath the rain, slower, kinder, ready to begin again. The candle on my table had burned low, its wax pooling at the base like a miniature lake catching the light. The air inside the cafe had cooled slightly, touched by the freshness that follows long rain. I could hear faint footsteps from the barista. Somewhere behind the counter, the soft rustle of cloth, the clink of porcelain. Every sound seemed magnified by quiet. When I glanced at the shelf near the window, I noticed a small tin box beside the register. It was different from the one I'd placed my letter in earlier, older, dented, its lid held closed by a simple loop of twine. A faint label, handwritten and fading, read, "Stories written on napkins." Curiosity drew me closer. The barista appeared almost instantly, as though the cafe itself had alerted her. "Would you like to see?" she asked. I hesitated. "Are they private?" She shook her head gently. "They're gifts. People leave them for others, who come later to remind them they aren't alone." She untied the string and opened the box. Inside were hundreds of folded napkins, each soft-edged from touch and time. Some had coffee stains shaped like moons. Others bore neat, delicate handwriting or hurried scrawls that seemed almost carved by emotion. "Go ahead," she said. "Pick one." I reached in and pulled out the first that caught my eye, a square of fabric-thin paper, torn slightly at the corner. The ink had bled from damp fingers, but the words were still legible. If you ever sit here alone, remember someone once sat in this same chair and thought the world had ended. It didn't. I read it twice, then again. It felt as if the writer had been sitting exactly where I was now, leaving behind a voice across time. Another napkin, folded beneath, carried just a few words. Love doesn't vanish. It changes its address. I smiled, feeling the faint sting behind my eyes. There was such honesty in the messages, no grand wisdom. Just small truths written by people who had weathered storms and chosen to reach out instead of closing in. The barista leaned on the counter, watching me read. "When the rain stops," she said. These words hum quietly, like shells remembering the ocean. It's how the cafe keeps its promise. Every pain turned into something someone else might need. I placed the napkins back carefully, almost reverently. "Does anyone ever come back to read their own?" "Sometimes," she said, "but they hardly recognize the words. That's when I know they've healed." I looked around the room again. The clocks continued their uneven ticking, but now they sounded almost like a choir, imperfect but harmonious. The woman's lavender vase still stood where she'd left it, the petals slightly wilted but fragrant. The chairs were crooked, the candles uneven, and yet everything felt whole. "Do you ever write one?" I asked her. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the tin. "Only once. What did you write?" Her eyes softened. "I wrote, 'When you finally forgive yourself, come back. The rain will be waiting.'" I wondered how many people had read that and believed it was meant for them. Maybe all of them were right. She closed the lid, tied the twine again, and set the box back in its place. "Would you like to leave one too?" I thought about it. My fingers brushed the pen resting beside the register, still faintly warm from her touch. "Not yet," I said. "I think I'm still listening." She nodded. "That's fine. The rain never rushes anyone." I returned to my seat, the sound of the storm outside gentler now, like someone running their fingers lightly along the windows. The letter lay where I'd left it. The candle flickered low, and I found myself wondering who would sit here next, what they might need to read, what they might leave behind. The cafe seemed to exist for that, to gather these fragments of human tenderness, stitch them together with a thread of rain, and offer them back to the world in cups of tea and folded napkins. I picked up my pen again and turned a new napkin over in my hand. Not to write, not yet, just to feel the texture, soft, thin, but strong enough to hold words that could outlast storms. Maybe tomorrow I would write something. Maybe I already had. Behind me, the barista whispered something I barely caught, maybe to herself, maybe to the cafe. Every letter finds its echo. And in the hush that followed, the clocks all ticked in unison for one perfect, fleeting second. The rain had slowed to a fine mist by the time I stepped outside. It wasn't really stopping. It was simply learning to fall more quietly. The street beyond the cafe glistened like liquid glass, every puddle catching the glow of the lamps and holding it still. I didn't know what time it was, and for the first time in years, I didn't care. Something in me had changed. Not in the dramatic way that stories often promise, no sudden clarity, no burst of revelation, but in a subtler sense, like the way morning light changes a familiar room. I felt the difference not as noise, but as calm. I walked along the narrow lane, and every sound around me seemed to hum with the same rhythm as my breath. The shuffle of my shoes through shallow water, the rustle of leaves slick with rain, the sigh of distant tires passing through puddles. But the cafe door still glowed behind me, a steady amber light cutting through the mist. I turned once, half expecting to see the barista waving, or the woman with the lavender vase smiling from the window. There was no one, only that soft golden light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I thought about going back. I thought about how easy it would be to push the door open again, to ask one more question, to hold on to the warmth a little longer. But something inside me whispered that I shouldn't. The warmth wasn't meant to be kept. It was meant to be carried, so I kept walking. The air smelled different now, cleaner, sweeter, carrying the faint perfume of wet earth and the ghost of bergamot. I passed a familiar street corner, one I'd walked 100 times before, but tonight it felt new. Maybe it was me who was new. The rain began again, but lighter, just enough to bead on my coat and hair. I didn't open my umbrella. Instead, I tilted my face toward the sky and let the drops touch my skin. They were cold at first, then comforting, as if reminding me that even falling could be gentle. At the next intersection, a small bookstore glowed faintly, its display window filled with stacks of forgotten novels and postcards curled at the edges. I paused there, staring at the reflections dancing across the glass. And then, as if drawn by something more than curiosity, I stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, the same tone as the cafes. The scent of paper and dust wrapped around me, warm and familiar. Behind the counter, an elderly man looked up from a book and smiled. "Late night for wandering," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. "Ah," he nodded. "Then you found the right place. We stay open for people like you." My heart gave a small, startled flutter. The words were different, but the kindness was the same. For a second, I almost asked if he knew the cafe, but something in his expression stopped me, the same quiet knowing I'd seen in the barista's eyes. Maybe all these places were connected, not by doors or streets, but by the people who needed them. I browsed the shelves for a while, running my fingers along the spines of books that looked well loved. One thin volume caught my eye, Letters Left in the Rain. I pulled it free and opened to a random page. The first line read, "Some places exist only to remind us that healing doesn't need witnesses." I smiled. Of course. I bought the book, tucked it under my arm, and stepped back out into the mist. The street was empty now, the puddles still reflecting faint streaks of light. Somewhere far off, I could hear a train passing, its sound low and comforting. I found myself walking slower, matching my steps to its rhythm. With each one, the world felt a little lighter, as if the night itself was exhaling. When I reached the corner again, I turned to glance back. The cafe was gone. The space where it had stood was just a blank stretch of dark brick wall, slick with rain. No door, no sign, no light. Only the faint outline of water on the ground where the threshold had been. I didn't feel fear or loss, just a quiet gratitude, like after a dream that leaves behind something you can't name but still carry. I pressed a hand to my coat pocket. The envelope the barista had given me was still there, warm even through the fabric. I didn't open it. I just held it for a while, feeling the gentle pulse beneath my fingers, as though the rain itself was still breathing with me. The mist began to lift. Somewhere ahead, the horizon glowed with the first pale hint of morning. I walked toward it, slow and unhurried, each step rippling through puddles that caught the growing light. And as I moved farther away, the memory of the cafe followed not as an image, but as a feeling, the taste of honey and bergamot, the hum of uneven clocks, the warmth of forgiveness settling in the chest. Maybe that's what it meant when she said the cafe never closed. Maybe it wasn't a place at all. Maybe it was a rhythm one that would stay with me, quietly, every time it rained. By the time the first pale glow of dawn reached the edge of the city, the rain had faded into something lighter than sound. Just the occasional drop slipping from a branch, a ripple spreading through a forgotten puddle. I found myself walking aimlessly, though aimless didn't feel quite right anymore. My feet knew where they were going. I was simply following. The streets were empty, not deserted, just resting. The kind of quiet that comes only after the world has forgiven itself for being noisy. Shop signs gleamed faintly under the weak streetlights, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and bakery yeast. The hum of the city's heart had slowed to a rhythm I could finally keep up with. I walked past the bus stop, its glass still fogged from the night's rain, and saw a small poster taped crookedly to the pole. It read, "We heal the moment we stop asking the past to apologize." No name, no date, just those words printed on damp paper. I smiled. Maybe the world was full of quiet cafes, disguised as corners and signs and tiny acts of grace. My shoes left soft prints on the wet pavement, fading behind me almost as soon as I made them. I thought of her again, not as the woman I lost, but as someone who had also been learning, stumbling, searching. Maybe she'd found her own version of the cafe somewhere. Maybe she was okay now. That thought didn't hurt anymore. It felt like relief. I reached into my coat pocket, fingertips brushing the envelope the barista had given me. It felt warm, still. My name was written on it in small, looping letters, a handwriting that looked strangely familiar, though I couldn't place it. I decided to open it when I found somewhere quiet to sit. A few streets later, I came across a small park, still glistening with rain. The benches were damp, but the air was gentle, and a faint golden light was starting to filter through the trees. I sat on the far bench, beneath a maple branch that still dripped tiny beads of water onto my shoulder. I tore the envelope open carefully. Inside was a single folded card, thick and textured, smelling faintly of bergamot. The handwriting inside was simple, and even neither hers nor mine. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself who stayed in pain. You've already made it home. Keep walking. That was all. No signature. No explanation. Just that quiet instruction, which somehow felt like a promise. I closed my eyes and held the card against my chest. The warmth spread outward slowly, like sunlight on skin after a storm. I realized then that I wasn't sad. Not really. The ache that had followed me for so long had thinned into something softer, like music played from another room. For a long time, I sat there, listening to the world wake up. A bird shook rain from its feathers on a nearby branch. The breeze carried the smell of wet grass and smoke from a bakery starting its morning ovens. Somewhere, a door opened and closed with the same gentle chime as the cafe's bell. I took a deep breath and whispered into the empty park, "I forgive you." It wasn't for her. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for the version of me who had clung to ghosts, who thought love was something you earned through suffering. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The morning received them quietly, like a secret it already knew. After a while, I pulled the small book I'd bought, Letters Left in the Rain, from my coat pocket. I opened to a random page and found another underlined line waiting there for me. Sometimes healing isn't about returning to who you were, but meeting who you've become. I read it aloud, just to hear it outside my head. The sound of my own voice in the empty park felt strange, but alive, real. When I looked up again, the clouds had begun to thin, letting streaks of pale gold slip through. The puddles on the pavement caught that light and scattered it, tiny fragments of morning flickering in every direction. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like something was missing. The emptiness inside me wasn't absence, it was space. Room for the next thing to arrive. I stood, slipped the note back into my pocket, and began to walk toward wherever the day might take me. The wind brushed gently through my hair, cool and damp, and I found myself smiling without thinking. Behind me, I could still feel the echo of the cafe, the scent of bergamot, the hum of uneven clocks, the warmth of the barista's voice. It wasn't fading. It was becoming part of me. Maybe the cafe didn't exist in one place at all. Maybe it lived in the hearts of those who'd found it, each of us carrying a small doorway inside. one that would open again whenever the rain returned. And for the first time, I hoped it would rain again soon. The sun had risen enough to touch the rooftops now, brushing the world with its soft, forgiving gold. It wasn't the sharp light of noon, but the kind that still carries traces of night, quiet, hesitant, merciful. I walked without direction, each step feeling like part of a slow ritual of return. The puddles glowed beneath my shoes, mirroring a sky that had finally cleared. I crossed a bridge I'd never noticed before. Below, the river swelled with rainwater, moving slowly, glinting like liquid pewter. The city was waking, the distant rattle of shutters opening, a kettle's whistle somewhere, the hush of early footsteps on wet pavement. And through it all, that familiar rhythm, the world exhaling after it's done crying. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and leaned on the railing. The air was cool, still scented faintly of rain and steel. My reflection in the water below looked softer, calmer. The face of someone who had survived a long storm, no longer trying to make sense of every drop. I took out the small card again. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself who stayed in pain. I traced the letters with my thumb. Each word seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat that had been waiting to be heard. That's when I noticed a paper boat floating downstream. It was small and uneven, probably folded by a child, its edges darkened by the night's rain. As it drifted beneath me, I couldn't help but smile. I tore a page from my notebook, scribbled a few words, and folded it carefully into another boat dot. Thank you for finding me in the rain. I set it on the surface of the river and watched it catch the current. It spun once, twice, then began to follow the other boat, carried together toward whatever came next. The sight filled me with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years, not for anyone else, but for the quiet companionship between everything that drifts. The city around me was coming to life now. Bicycles, a few morning voices, a dog barking from somewhere unseen. Yet I didn't feel like I was leaving the cafe behind. If anything, it felt as though I was carrying it with me in the rhythm of my breath, in the softness of how I now looked at the world. When I turned down another street, I passed a small bakery, its windows fogged from the warmth inside, and through the glass, I saw a woman arranging loaves in neat rows. She looked up just as I walked by and smiled. For a brief, dizzying second, she looked exactly like the barista. Same calm eyes, same knowing kindness. I almost stopped, but then I realized it didn't matter if it was her. The world was full of echoes, not copies, but reminders. Gentle reflections of what we once loved, showing up in new shapes just to tell us we're still being cared for. I bought a croissant and sat by the window. The first bite tasted like butter and comfort, the kind of warmth you don't have to earn. People walked by outside, faces still sleepy, some carrying umbrellas, even though the rain had stopped. I imagined each of them had their own cafe, maybe a bench, a song, a small ritual that helped them make peace with themselves. I took the card out once more and turned it over. On the back, faintly, almost invisible in the light, I noticed something written in pencil. P.S. The rain will come again, but it doesn't always mean sorrow. I laughed quietly under my breath. It felt like the kind of secret you share with the wind, small, sacred, and meant only for those who've learned to listen. When I finished eating, I tucked the note back into my pocket and stepped outside. The air had shifted again, lighter, touched by warmth. The puddles were shrinking, their surfaces broken by the first curious birds landing for a sip. The city smelled new. I walked until I reached a narrow alley that opened into a familiar square. The cobblestones still glistened faintly, and though I knew the cafe wouldn't be there, I turned my head toward where its door might have been. Just a wall now, blank and damp. But if I closed my eyes, I could still see it. The glow of the lamps, the curve of the barista's smile, the way the rain painted silver lines down the window. I whispered softly, "I'll come back someday." A gust of wind passed through, carrying the faintest chime, maybe from a distant shop bell, maybe not. It sounded exactly like the cafe's door. For a moment, I stood there, letting that sound settle in my chest like a blessing. Then I turned and began to walk again, toward the edge of morning, where light poured gently through the thinning cloud's dot, and though the city was awake, the rain asleep, I knew I could still find that quiet whenever I needed to, not by searching, but by remembering how to listen. The cafe had never been a place. It had been a moment, and that moment, somehow, was still alive in me. By the time the morning settled fully into light, I'd walked so far that the streets no longer looked familiar. The city had changed its face again, as it often does after rain, cleaner, gentler, almost tender. The air shimmered faintly with warmth rising from the cobblestones. The clouds had drifted apart, leaving behind a pale blue sky brushed with thin streaks of white, stopped near a small square where vendors were setting up their stalls. The scent of coffee mingled with damp earth and fresh bread. A child chased a pigeon across the stones, laughing, his boots splashing through the last of the puddles. The world had returned to its rhythm. Only I felt slightly out of step, like a traveler who had come back from somewhere no one else believed existed. I sat on a low stone wall, watching the light play across the windows. For a fleeting moment, the reflection of the sun on a glass pane looked exactly like the cafe's door, a golden rectangle glowing faintly through the mist. I blinked, and it was gone. But the warmth that image left behind stayed. It occurred to me, then, that maybe the cafe didn't disappear when dawn arrived. Maybe it simply shifted into the small, quiet places of the world, into the smile of the baker, the laughter of the child, the hush between two heartbeats. It was everywhere. If you listened closely enough. As the sun climbed higher, I took out my notebook again. The pages were warped from the damp air, but the ink still flowed easily. I began to write, not to anyone, not even to myself, but to the cafe. You existed when I needed you most. You reminded me that sorrow is not a punishment, but a passage. You showed me that endings are simply doors with no signs. If you ever find someone else lost in the rain, tell them I left the lights on for them. I closed the notebook and sat quietly, letting the words breathe. A soft wind passed through the square, lifting the corners of the market tents and carrying the faint sound of distant bells. For a moment, I thought I heard the cafe's chime again, light and delicate, echoing through the morning air. The baker waved at me from her stall. "Coffee?" she called. I smiled. "Yes, please." She poured it into a small paper cup and handed it to me with a warmth that felt older than habit. "Rough night?" she asked, though her tone was gentle, teasing. "Long one," I admitted. "Well," she said, "some mornings taste better after rain." I thanked her and took a sip. The coffee was rich and smooth, the heat of it grounding me back into the world. As I stood there, I noticed something small pinned beside her register, a napkin slightly wrinkled, with words written in careful handwriting. "When you finally forgive yourself, come back. The rain will be waiting." My breath caught. It was the same line the barista had told me. The baker noticed me staring and smiled knowingly. "Someone left that here years ago," she said. "I never took it down. People like to read it when they're having a bad day." I nodded slowly, my heart swelling with that strange mix of awe and gratitude that language never quite fits. "Do you know who wrote it?" She shrugged. "Maybe you did," she said with a wink, and turned back to her bread. I left some coins on the counter and stepped back into the sunlight. The street shimmered, alive again with motion and noise, but none of it felt harsh. Even the clatter of carts and chatter of voices carried a kind of softness. Like rain turned to music. As I walked away, I looked once more at the napkin fluttering slightly in the breeze. It wasn't an artifact of mystery anymore. It was proof that kindness leaves traces even after the storm passes. The city moved around me, bright and ordinary. Yet somewhere, in the rhythm of footsteps and laughter and wind, I could still hear the slow ticking of mismatched clocks, still smell bergamot and bread, still feel the echo of quiet warmth waiting on the other side of a wooden door. And I realized the cafe hadn't faded at dawn. It had simply spread itself through the world, in notes, in gestures, in every act of softness we leave behind for strangers. The rain had ended, but its memory remained. Shining quietly on everything it touched, the day grew warmer as I walked farther into the waking city. The clouds drifted apart completely now, leaving only the faintest scent of rain clinging to the air. That fragile, sweet smell that lives for just a few hours after a storm. Streets gleamed in slow patches of sunlight, puddles shrinking into mirrors of sky. Every sound seemed sharper yet kinder. The soft swish of broom bristles sweeping water into drains. The distant chatter of morning vendors, a dog shaking droplets from its coat. I carried the warmth of the cafe with me, like a hidden flame. It wasn't a thing I could describe or even name. It was simply there, inside the rhythm of my steps, inside the steady, unhurried pulse of the day. I turned down a side street lined with old plane trees. The leaves still glistened with rain, and the wind brushed them together like whispers. The air beneath was cool and green, and I felt suddenly as though I were walking through a memory, not of any single moment, but of all the quiet mornings I'd ever missed noticing. When I reached the end of the street, a small park opened before me. A fountain stood at its center, its basin half filled with rainwater. A few pigeons hopped along the edge, sipping from the surface. I sat on a wooden bench facing the water. My coat still smelled faintly of bergamot. The city around me was alive but not loud, its hum softened by the lingering dampness of the storm. I watched the fountain for a long time, tracing the way each drop from its stone spout made small rings that spread, overlapped, and disappeared. It reminded me of what the barista had said, that nothing ever truly leaves. It just changes its shape. In my pocket, the envelope and the small sketch from the girl with the quiet eyes rested together. I pulled them out and laid them side by side on the bench. The drawing had dried completely now, two hands meeting in a swirl of steam, but somehow it looked different in the daylight. The lines seemed lighter, the space between them fuller. A thought came to me, simple, almost childlike, that perhaps healing doesn't happen all at once, but in moments like this, sitting alone under a pale sun, surrounded by the echo of rain, with proof of kindness small enough to fit inside your palm. I unfolded my notebook again and wrote just one line beneath the words I'd written earlier. When the heart learns to listen, even silence speaks kindly. Then I closed it and leaned back, letting the wind turn the pages if it wanted to. An old woman walked past with her dog, nodding to me. A few raindrops fell from the trees, landing softly on my sleeve, remnants of a night now long gone. I smiled and didn't brush them away. For a moment, I imagined the cafe door appearing again somewhere nearby, between two trees, maybe, or at the end of the park's path. The golden glow spilling gently onto the grass, the scent of honey and tea weaving through the morning air. I could almost hear the low tick of the mismatched clocks, the soft chime of the bell, as someone new walked in from the rain. Maybe someone was, right now. Someone carrying their own letter, their own quiet ache. And maybe the barista was already pouring them tea, already saying, "Everyone who finds this place has something heavy to put down." The thought filled me with a tenderness I couldn't hold in words. I looked up. The clouds were drifting again, gathering faintly at the horizon. Somewhere far away, another rain was beginning. Not here, Not for me, but for someone else who needed it. And that, I realized, was how the world stayed balanced. Storm to storm, calm to calm, one heart learning what another had already found. I stood, brushed the damp from my coat, and slipped the note and drawing back into my pocket. As I began to walk, the bench behind me gleamed in the sunlight, the faint rings of raindrops slowly evaporating into air dot every few steps. I caught glimpses of light pooling in puddles, reflections that shifted with my movement, fragments of the cafe's warmth scattered throughout the morning. I imagined collecting them, one by one, and realized I already had. They lived inside me now. And as the city stretched toward noon, alive and golden, I whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you for the rain." It felt like the right thing to say. By afternoon, the city had completely dried, though the air still carried that faint metallic tone that always follows a night of rain. The sun was soft, the kind that didn't glare, but rather rested on the rooftops like a hand on a sleeping shoulder. Everything seemed slower now. Traffic, footsteps, even time itself. I walked toward the edge of town, following no plan, just the rhythm of my own breathing. The streets thinned, buildings giving way to quiet stretches of field and sky. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear wind chimes. Each note hung in the air for a moment before drifting away, like the echo of something kind that refuses to leave completely. Eventually, I reached a small hill overlooking the city. From here, I could see the rooftops glinting faintly, the faint thread of the river, the long gray ribbon of road that wound through it all. I sat on a flat stone, pulled my coat closer, and let the breeze move through me. The world felt vast again, not the heavy vastness of loneliness, but the open, generous kind that makes you want to breathe deeper. I thought of all the people who had passed through that mysterious cafe. The man with the lily, the girl with the sketches, the woman with rain-bright eyes who taught me about forgiveness. Maybe they were all out there somewhere, walking beneath the same sky, carrying their own small warmths home. Maybe they, too, were looking at this same horizon, quietly thanking the rain for what it took and what it gave back. The barista's voice came to me then, as clear as if she were sitting beside me. The dawn doesn't arrive by hour here. It arrives by acceptance. I smiled. I understood now. The cafe had never been about finding answers. It had been about learning to stop asking for them, to sit long enough in the quiet that life itself begins to speak again. I pulled out the little envelope one last time. The paper had softened, edges curling slightly from being opened and folded so many times. Inside, the same words waited for me, calm and unchanging. "You've already made it home." I looked at them under the sunlight, the ink catching the faintest shimmer. The words didn't feel like instruction anymore. They felt like memory, a promise already kept. I folded the note and set it down on the stone beside me, letting the wind lift it if it wanted to. It fluttered once, twice, and then lay still. The world below seemed to glow brighter, colors deepened by distance, the silver of the river, the amber of roofs, the last hints of rain still clinging to leaves. It struck me that beauty always looks most vivid after it's been washed. I closed my eyes and breathed in. The scent of damp soil, faint tea, and something like smoke from a chimney far away filled the air. In the hush behind those sounds, I could almost hear it again. The soft clink of porcelain cups, the uneven ticking of clocks, the rain whispering against windows. The cafe would never be gone. It would live in every quiet room where someone forgave themselves, every street that smelled of wet earth, every night when rain arrived not as grief, but as grace. A cloud passed over the sun for a moment, cooling the air. Then, as it moved on, the light returned stronger this time, spilling across everything. I watched as it touched the city, the trees, the road, and finally my hands. I thought of the way the barista had said goodbye, her smile carrying both farewell and welcome at once. Maybe she'd said the same words to everyone who found their way to that door. You'll carry the quiet now. That's enough. I stood slowly, brushing dust from my coat. The wind caught the folded note at last, lifting it gently into the air. It spun once, caught the light, and drifted downward into the tall grass below. I didn't chase it. Some things are meant to stay behind, to keep the world company when we leave Dot. As I turned to go, I caught one final shimmer on the horizon, something golden, soft, impossibly familiar. It flickered for just a breath before blending back into sunlight at the cafe, perhaps. Or maybe just the memory of it, waving from afar. I smiled, letting the wind carry that thought wherever it wished. And as I walked down the hill, the last line of the story wrote itself quietly in my mind. Like steam rising from a cup, in every storm, there is a place that waits for the broken to sit a while, to listen, and to heal Dot, and when the rain ends, they leave lighter, but never empty.